I would like to acknowledge the First Nations people who are the traditional owners and custodians of these lands in Australia, and I pay respects to the elders past, present and emerging. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander viewers are advised that this presentation may contain images, voices and videos of deceased persons. The definition of racism is the belief that different races possess distinct characteristics, abilities or qualities, especially to distinguish them as inferior or superior to one another. This is what racism in Australia is, and it's unacceptable. People in Australia are treated just like trash, just for their skin tone, and we turn a blind eye to it, pretending that it doesn't exist. So I say, racism, it stops with me. Racism in Australia has been around since the arrival of the first settlers, when they stole the Aboriginals' sacred land that they had lived on for hundreds of thousands of years. They were unable to practice their own culture or beliefs as a result of massacres, slavery, and the stolen generation, who were forcibly separated from their parents and forced to live with a white family in a white society. This has caused the Aboriginals a great deal of pain, grief, suffering, and cultural loss. Despite the fact that there has been racial abuse throughout Australian history, there have been many people who have said enough is enough and stood up to racism, such as Vincent Lingari, who led the Wave Hill Walk-Off, demanding better pay, conditions, and rights to their traditional land. Finally, in 1967, the Australian government held a referendum to count Aboriginals as Australian citizens, and not as flora and fauna. So ask yourself, am I only human if I have light skin? Because that was only true in Australia only 55 years ago. There is no room for racism. Today, Australia is not much better. People with dark skin can still walk down the street and be treated with prejudice and discrimination. A more well-known example of modern racism is Adam Gooder's stand against racism in 2013, when he was called an ape by a 13-year-old girl during an AFL Indigenous round, later to be booed by a crowd every time he got a free kick. In the film The Final Quarter, we can see that racism that he was facing caused him immense mental and emotional pain, causing him to take an indefinite leave from the AFL and not long later resign. This incident also affected others, like Nicky Winwar, when he did not want to be put back in the spotlight again after 20 years prior to Adam Goodes made a stand against racism by pointing to the skin on his chest and saying, "I am black, and I am proud to be black." If I was in Adam's situation, I would have felt angry, upset, and disappointed in Australian society and how it treats racism. The worst part of all of this is how internet personalities can make a prejudiced or racist remark and then make up an excuse and we let them get away with it. There is no excuse for racism, and Kevin Rudd knew this when he made his national apology to the Indigenous people of Australia and the Torres Strait Islands for the mistreatment that previous governments have caused them. Kevin Rudd also promised that the government would try to solve some Indigenous issues by closing the gap in shorter life expectancy, educational outcomes, higher imprisonment rates, and lower job opportunities. The goal was to close the gap by 2020, and it's now 2022. The gap is far from being closed. This is why we have Reconciliation Week, Indigenous Rounds in Sport, and educational programs like racism. It stops with me. Because by learning about racism and incorporating days to celebrate Indigenous culture, we can work towards a future with little to no racism. I am astounded after learning about the racism and other issues that Indigenous people have faced and continue to face. I am appalled at how we can say we are a proud country when our society and culture are built around the ignorance towards racism. It is my ethical responsibility to stand up against racism, and when I see it, fight for a racism-free future. It will be a noteworthy day when racism is eradicated, but for that to happen, it takes more than one person. It takes a whole nation to say there is no room for racism. As a nation, we must focus on putting aside prejudice and celebrating our differences, whether they be race, religion, or anything else. This can be done through things such as NAIDOC Week or Indigenous Rounds. So remember to say no to racism, because there is one earth, one humanity, one chance, and one love. It's like that quote from Colonel West that says, "None of us alone can save a nation or the world, but each of us can make a positive difference if we commit ourselves to do so." So I say to you, go out into your lives and stand against racism, because together We can stop this.